So I can come back.
Yeah, all right, Gordon.
Hello, I'm Dwayne. I'm a former student of Chagas. I'm Theo. I'm also a former student of Chagas.
My name's Kay. I'm also a former student.
Who isn't?
I'm Renee. Also a former student.
My name is Elliot. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm Max's sister.
I would never have guessed. Yeah, all right. Okay. So we are now live on the internet.
Hey.
Welcome to our online audience. We've already introduced ourselves here in person, but for those of you joining us online, welcome to Dragging or In the Drag of a Queer Life with anthropologist and artist Shaka McLaughlin, which is such a fun name to say. I have to just say that. And Drag King Max Pleasure. My name is Greg Newton. I am the co-founder of the Bureau of General Services Queer Division, along with my partner, Donnie Jokum. And the Bureau is a project that we founded back in 2012. We will be 12 years old on Friday. So yes, thank you. We've survived a lot. I'll leave it at that. And we are an all-volunteer independent queer bookstore. Today we're being helped by our volunteer Jeffrey Archer. And that is how we do things here. We're all volunteer. We depend on sales and donations to keep this machine churning forward. And so, yeah, I'm going to pass around a bag. If you're able to make a donation, we especially encourage you to make a donation if you know you won't be buying any books. And I should mention that Shaka's book, Dragging, is being offered at a special price of $30. So today's the day to get that. But if you know you won't be buying a book, we ask if you can make a donation. We'd appreciate it. So there's some change in the bag. There's also a Venmo QR code on the back if you'd like to give to Venmo. Likewise, for those of you online, if you'd like to make a donation, you can do that on Venmo at BGSQD. I'll pass that around. And if you're not already on our email list and you would like to be, you can sign up for that at the back of the room or on our website, which is bgsqd.com. And you'll get an email every other Monday about our many upcoming events. We keep quite a busy calendar here. Did I already mention our hours? If not, I'll mention our hours. We're open Wednesdays through Sundays from 1 to 7 p.m. And then we often stay open later when we have events. But our weekend events tend to be usually afternoon events. So the only other thing you'll hear from me, well, a few things actually. I'd like to read a land acknowledgement and a statement of solidarity with the people of Palestine, and then I'll introduce Shaka and Max Pleasure. So the Bureau acknowledges that our organization operates on the unceded land of the Munsee Lenape. We encourage you to join the Bureau in signing up to make a monthly donation to the American Indian Community Houses Mannahatta Fund. The Mannahatta Fund, according to its website, is an invitation to all settlers and non-native people who wish to acknowledge the legacy of theft and genocide that comprise the history of New York City and the United States. And you can find out more at mannahattafund.org. The Bureau also recognizes Palestinian liberation as a queer issue. As queer people, we know the pain of being cast out. We have been and continue to be despised by many, even by our own parents, families, and communities of origin. This reality evokes in many of us a deep empathy with others who are likewise seen not as fully human, but as problems to be solved, questions for which the answer is ultimately elimination and erasure. As we watch the ongoing genocide of Palestinians by the State of Israel, carried out with the full support of our government and funded by our tax dollars, we witness the inevitable results of defining a people solely as a threat to the safety and well-being of those deemed inherently worthy of life. This horror compels us to speak out not only against the current bombardment and siege of Gaza by the State of Israel, but against the historical and ongoing violent displacement of Palestinians by Zionists and the condition of occupation and apartheid under which Palestinians have been living for over 75 years. In our longing for a very different reality, we take inspiration from the words of Jose Esteban Munoz, who wrote, "Queerness is essentially about the rejection of a here and now and an insistence on potentiality or concrete possibility for another world." And that is from his lovely 2009 book, Cruising Utopia, which we have for sale in our nonfiction section. Just a little plug there as well. So let me introduce Shaka and Max. Shaka McLaughlin is professor of media studies and anthropology at Purchase College, SUNY, where they also serve as chair of media studies and gender studies programs. An anthropologist and artist, their work stages encounters between Black study, welcome Max, welcome to the stage, between Black study, queer theory, media, and art. They have written and lectured widely on networked intimacies and messy computational entanglements as they interface with queer of color life worlds. They are the author of Dragging, or In the Drag of a Queer Life from 2021, and Virtual Intimacies, Media, Affect, and Queer Sociality from 2013, and dozens of chapters and articles. They are also the co-editor of 2 edited collections, Black Genders and Sexualities, with Dana Ain Davis Palgrave from 2012, and Zombies and Sexuality with Steve Jones McFarland, 2014. Their work has been supported by the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, Academic Schloss Solitude, the Andy Warhol Foundation, and Data and Society. Max Pleasure is an award-winning drag king based in NYC. He shares advice for all kinds of drag performers and stories from his own drag journey, like performing at Bushwig, the Austin International Drag Festival, Sasha Velour's Nightgowns, winning the Brooklyn Nightlife Award for Drag King of the Year, inspiring the short documentary Max, if that's how you pronounce it, many X's, and even more. Max also weighs in on LGBTQ+ issues and conversations, reviews TV shows, movies, books, and music videos, and can't help but fan person over his favorite celebs. Please give them both a very warm welcome.
So thanks to everyone for coming, and hi to everyone who's online. So the way it'll work is I'm going to give like a 20-minute or so talk, and then I'm going to bring Max back up, and we're going to do like a little chat between Max and me, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So I'll call you back up in 20. Perfect. Thanks. All right. So first, I just want to thank Greg and Donnie and Jeffrey and everyone at the Bureau for making this event possible. I think especially in the time that we're living, the times that we've been living, that it's always great to come together in community. And so it's so great to see so many familiar faces. And Gordon, nice to meet you. So one of the lesser known secrets of anthropological and other research is that it actually starts really close to home, like really close with intimacies. This project began that way with binge watching RuPaul's Drag Race with a then new partner and deciding on the field sites based on our likely travel plans. He's Israeli, and we had plans to spend time in Berlin, and so Israel and Berlin became part of the project. I was awarded a fellowship that allowed us to live in Berlin from the summer of 2013 through 2014. And during that time, we also traveled frequently to Israel, Palestine. I made other trips to see family in Oregon and Texas, to work at a second gig in Vermont, and to attend a spiritual retreat in India. And I came home sick from that trip to India, which impacted my ability to conduct research for the duration of my fieldwork in Berlin. To the slide. So yeah, we have our little slideshow. There we go. Beautiful.
And Oh, it always covers things up for me.
So entangling love and research comes with risks too. And yeah, there we go.
Why is it not doing them?
There we go.
Oh, it's showing. Oh,
That's something. That's
okay,
good.
great.
We'll go back a little bit.
Okay, I'm trying to get rid of that.
Hmm.
All right.
That's,
Forward.
you're good.
And
Let's go. Great. And we'll go to the next slide, please.
doesn't want to.
There we go. There we go. Failure, failing. Yes, that's perfect. Perfect slide, perfect moment. So entangling love and research comes with risks too. And when my relationship began to fray, it was really difficult to hold the project threads together too. So 3 years after starting the project, with most of the book researched and written, my partner and I split. And it took me a few years before my heartbreak had healed enough for me to return to finish the project. And when I did return, I was confronted with failures, like the bitter hurt of my breakup, the difficult acknowledgement that the research hadn't lived up to my expectations. But I left these failures on the surface of the text and tried to disappear them behind a veneer of academic politeness. To borrow from the anthropologist James Clifford, I wanted to produce an ethnography that retained, in his words, some of the discursive mess, the cacophony of contradictions of the sort that are found in actual cultural life. So the book features, slide, 13 portraits of artists and activists who use drag, broadly defined, in their output. And this is some of them. So we have at the top, Galina, and then we have Caipirinha on the far right. We have Max right there, bottom left. We have Nico in the center, another former Purchase student. And then we have Liad Hussein Kantarovich, who I'll be talking about today. So one more slide, please. So if we want to talk about cacophony of contradictions, we can talk about RuPaul's Drag Race, right? So, and RuPaul's Drag Race has plenty of these cacophonies and contradictions, right? So on the one hand, it sympathetically portrays queer people invested in femme drag, many of them people of color, but it simultaneously puts them through these really grueling challenges as they compete for a $200,000 prize. And if you've never seen the show, is anyone here who hasn't seen the show? Who's never seen RuPaul's Drag Race ever? Okay, gotcha. But for anyone who might be watching online who's never seen it somehow, and who's on this talk, right? You have to do all of the things, right? You have to be a makeup artist, a hair artist, a designer, a runway model, but also you have to be a comic, a choreographer, a singer, and so on. So and then there's also the spectacle of reality, of cruelty that is reality television, right? Contestants must not only excel in these various artistic disciplines, but also navigate the emotional and interpersonal aspects of the competition, which is, of course, designed to extract the most affectively poignant moments of contestants' lives, like stories about being kicked out of home, of sexual assault, of drag saving their lives, of gender nonconformity, of transition, and more. This formula is bank, Auntie. And I read it, right, as this sort of spectacle of cruelty, but I also always cry when I watch the show, right? So something is happening. One more slide. So it's now, I think it just completed its 16th season. I'm like writing, as I wrote this, I had to correct it this morning. It said wrote 15th, and I was like, no, it's 16th now. With numerous spin-offs from All Stars to numerous global franchises in Canada, the UK, Australia, Thailand, Italy, the Netherlands. You kind of get the idea. This is now a global drag empire. Okay, now we'll go to the next slide. So there was another cacophony of contradictions that inspired my focus on drag, and that kind of was like the seed that seeded this project. So in 2010, I was at a drag show in this tiny Jerusalem gay bar called Shushan. And in that, that's perfect. In that show, the Israeli drag queen Diva D bantered with the audience. And when she asked whether there were any tourists in the audience, I was like too shy to raise my hand, but a young woman toward the front was braver. And when Diva D asked, "Where are you from?" the young woman answered, "Germany." And then Diva D mocked her, like repeated Germany, and then performed a quick imitation of a Nazi salute. But she didn't keep dragging her. She said then in a softer voice, "Don't worry, honey, we're doing the same thing now too." This joke was quickly eclipsed by more playful banter and lip syncing, but that comment, that moment really stuck with me. Diva D had linked Jewish experiences of the Holocaust to contemporary Israeli policies affecting Palestinians and African migrants. And for a fleeting moment, this retort metamorphosed into something very like sharp-edged. Like it was a demand that hailed everyone in the audience: Ashkenazi, Mizrahi, and Ethiopian Jews, Arabs, German tourists, and this Black, ethnically ambiguous American anthropologist, and brought us all into the orbit of this seemingly impossible comparison. Using the in-between space of drag performance, she had demonstrated how the bad fun of drag, its refusal to play nice, might be used to provocatively reframe seemingly unspeakable situations. Unsurprisingly, she went on to get a PhD in sociology. Next slide, please.
There we go.
All right, Liad. So Liad Hussein Kantarovich has been based in Berlin since 2011, but was born and lived in Palestine, Israel until the age of 11, when her parents left the US for what she describes as political reasons. She returned in 2000, that is to Palestine, Israel, at the onset of the Second Intifada, and threw herself into the overlapping worlds of art making, activism, and queer world building. A founding member of the group Anarchists Against the Wall, she helped introduce words like queer and sex work into Israeli political discourse. And like many young left-leaning Israelis, she immigrated to Berlin because its anything goes attitude represented a welcome respite from political burnout and from the difficulties of life in Palestine and Israel. What my partner and other close Israeli friends sometimes describe now as Israel. A cisgender woman who draws extensively on drag styles and idioms, especially camps, knowing provocations. There's some seats up here, come on up. As well as on more female-centric burlesque traditions, Liad confounds the lines between art and activism. And she expresses her creative and political work through various characters that reflect her history and personality, even as they function as ciphers that can amplify or distort the fantasies and anxieties of different groups of people. So these characters are her, right? And they also are these very self-conscious performances. These include the queer DJ Jihad, the feminist cam sex worker, the Arab burlesque star, and the political dominatrix. I think you can do one more slide. Let's see. That's her. This is her like ordinary everyday look, by the way. It's not her drag look, right? This is just walking down the street. One of the last times I saw her in Berlin, maybe it was like 2 summers ago, like a year, like yeah, 2 years ago. She had just been coming from a music video shoot where she'd recorded this album and she'd shot this video. And this is not that unusual in Berlin, but you know, she had her look with all of her rings and bracelets and dangling, and she's like this tall. She has her red hair, and she had you know those things that you use if you got like in an emergency, those metal emergency blanket. Yeah, it's like the little metal foil. Right. And she was just carrying that behind her. And so it was like, that was like how she came to meet me at the Thai restaurant. Right. So her art and activism employ drag as conceptual punk provocation. So for me, like John Waters' Divine always came to mind, and so did New York's foul-mouthed Lady Bunny. So Liad, without sort of intentionally, but she is like their progeny. And she's also performance artist Carolee Schneemans, right? She's someone who does things around femininity and the body that, would be completely in keeping with the 70s feminist performance art space. So this next one is the slide that we would turn. Oh no, this is fine. So there are a couple of her projects. So before she left Israel, she was hosting weekly screenings of Drag Race, and this was a flyer for kind of her going away party when she left Israel, when she left Tel Aviv. Liad's Drag Race, and then the slide on the right, the image on the right is from a performance piece she did in I think 2012 or 2013, and that was then turned into this little short video called Ain't No Democracy Here. And so in this performance, what she was doing was she was bringing like slaves, like she was playing this like political dominatrix, and she was bringing like her dominated slaves to the polls to vote for candidates of her choosing. And it created all of these really interesting scenes where she, was like beating them with dildos and telling them to vote for like the, most left-wing people. And then people around were like at the polls were like watching. And at one point, at one of the performances, someone called the police, but then this rabbi intervened and was like, oh no, this is just like, it's just, they're just doing a school project. She's like hitting them with the dildo, and he was like, don't hit him so hard, but it's good that you're doing this. So, I mean, it created these really, pretty amazing scenes. So I think slide, and I think this is the one with the volume. Yeah, so we can't play this one. Also, it's like really dark anyway, but basically, so this is a,
I can play it and just
Okay,
turn the
sure.
volume off. Sorry, it's YouTube
So
copyright.
this
They will
uses,
shut this
this
down
uses Britney
fast.
Spears' Piece of Me. And in it, she's doing this burlesque as like, imagining herself as this like, as one of her like Arab burlesque performers. And she does a striptease, and her body is divided into a map of Israel-Palestine, into the occupied territories and the West Bank. So there's this like oral pun, like piece of me, but it's also like clearly like the pun part also is like about piece of meat, right? That the way that the female body is marked through the violences of colonialism and occupation. And other performances from this time, she would do things like, again, she's, she's Ashkenazi, but she would be in like this, like quote unquote Muslim drag, and then would perform in neighborhoods in Tel Aviv that had been historically known for street prostitution. And then she would like pull a, Israeli flag out of her vagina while she was menstruating. Like, I mean, she was like, she goes all out. Thanks, you can turn the lights back on. So if you didn't, in another piece, another hijab lip sync was called, the one I was just mentioning about the, Israeli flag in the vagina was called War is Good. So these are cultural and ethnic masquerades that we may think of as very like problematic, but that also conjure the sex, and that insofar as they conjure the sexualized, threatening Muslim others, but they also are doing something very explicit where she's signaling references to people like resistance fighters like Layla Khalid. So perfect. Next, that slide. So Kantorovic's drag is thus in keeping with performance artist and theorist Vaginal Davis's terrorist drag that Jose Munoz theorized in his book, Disidentification. So she uses this kind of terrorist drag through the vehicle of her gendered body like a weapon, right? Munoz used this idea to describe Vaginal Davis's work, and Vaginal Davis, you guys know Vaginal Davis, right? So Black drag queen, artist, and performance studies theorist who, has famously paired unlikely elements, like in this image, of whiteface and military fatigues in performances that were entertaining and also disturbing commentaries on race and sexuality. So Kantorovich similarly used the real and imagined power of a potentially revolutionary female sexuality to excite and trouble audiences. And then, of course, some audiences, among them many Zionists and right-wing commentators in Israel, have attacked her, in their words, as a filthy anarchist whore. But others have claimed her as a sex-positive feminist liberationist. And then some are merely frightened. So while a graduate student at a German art school, she engaged in a performance that referenced forms of political resistance common in the West Bank, rock throwing included, and at least one of her supervisors forgot to duck. Next slide. Okay. One of the policemen said to her, "We are the police." And then he showed her his gun, just like in one of her plays. "You're a criminal," another said, "and we'll treat you like one." So Natalie shouted for her neighbors. She was charged with resisting arrest and assaulting a police officer. She didn't have socks on, so the cuffs on her ankles dug into her legs. And when Brunhilde, my ex's chosen pseudonym, and I visited a few days after her arrest, you could still see bruises on her arms and feet. Natalie had been arrested for her video "Shit Instead of Blood," released online in the wake of 2014's Operation Protective Edge, one of the 6, now 7 wars between Israel and Hamas since Israel withdrew its troops from Gaza and began its siege in 2007. The charges against Natalie were for hurting the public's feelings and defiling national symbols. Right, that was my reaction. I was like, that can't be right. So I wrote to the Israeli legal scholar Eyal Gross about the case and just really to get more information about this law. And he was like, oh yeah, this is a total law. And he said that it actually developed the law out of a case brought against Jewish settlers who had caricatured Prophet Muhammad as a pig. So the video "Shit Instead of Blood" is a compilation of Natalie and her friend and her dog taking a shit on all the flags of the world, Israel's included. And she might be the, quote, most hated woman in Israel, as she was named during her first TV interview, momentarily supplanting then parliamentarian Hanin Zoabi. But her lack of remorse and the tea and cookies she laid out for us during our visits endeared her to me from the beginning. So I think you can do a slide. Let's see here. Yeah, Natalie has a big mouth. And by that I mean her mouth is like actually enormous. And she's also a big-mouthed troublemaker, shouting sense in the form of absurd theatrics to her fellow Israeli Jews. Although Israelis are stereotyped as being pushy and loud, these are also vital elements of Israeli theatrical histories, and she's very much embedded in these histories. Hanak Levine, for example, was a playwright who was known for his often vulgar satire. And while he was alive, he bitterly divided the public, but since he's been dead, everyone loves him. His work, like Natalie's, was also frequently scatological and frequently censored. For example, in his controversial play, Queen of the Bathtub, he took aim at Prime Minister Golda Meir and featured a character called Lord Keeper of the Enema. In a Haaretz editorial, Rachel Afer noted that Waksberg belonged to a glorious and even pioneering Israeli tradition of using feces to express grievance. So after being blacklisted by the Israeli theater scene, Natalie turned to YouTube. And perhaps her most provocative performance is the Shoah, the Holocaust. So, and this part always gets me, so if I need a moment, like, yeah. So this project began with a simple thought experiment. If the Holocaust were a person, how would she feel about how people talk about her? As she explained to my husband and me, the first thing is that they treat her like a whore. She is kind of a celebrity and a bit of a whore. She needs the crowd. So in this performance that is documented, where she goes to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem, which is a site designed to induce sober memorialization, she comes across like a deranged child playing princess, alternating sweet, sly, and furious. Flanked by friends who doubled as security guards, she was dressed merely in a slip. A tiara crowned her hair. She excoriated the witnessing public, especially Israeli politicians and anyone else who seeks to politically profit from the Jewish genocide. She shouts, "It's thanks to me that you can develop an atomic bomb and no one objects. For that alone, I deserve thunderous applause. Without me, you couldn't run a ghetto for 5 million people. I'm the best thing that ever happened to you. She also appears as the Holocaust in a video addressed to Palestinians. This time, solemnly addressing the camera, she simply says, "Hello, Palestinians. I am the Holocaust. Because of me, you had the Nakba." So I interviewed her a year after her arrest. She told my husband and me 2 long stories. One about what happened after a reading she'd been asked to do in Tel Aviv, which had been her first public invite in a really, really long time. So at first, the lefty audience seemed to appreciate her work, but just as she was about to leave, her mom, who'd driven her there and had been waiting in the car, came in and told her to stay put. There was a group of about 40 right-wing protesters, and they were there for Natalie. On the one hand, she said she was into it. I'm a public figure, I'm recognized. But she also knew that this scene was dangerous. She couldn't leave. They were shouting at her through the open windows. "Whore, traitor, you shit on our flag." Eventually, her mom left to bring the car around and then helped the owner muscle his way through the crowd. "I left like a celebrity," Natalie said. But not before one of the other lefty literati, who'd also read at the event, tone shamed her, saying, "If only you hadn't shit on the flag. If only you hadn't shouted back." She didn't think that there would be any more invites forthcoming, which made her sad because, as she told us, she's not a misanthrope. She really likes to communicate. Her celebrity had also followed her on a recent trip abroad. At the airport, she felt like she was being watched and followed. There were these men, she said. And she stood up and moved around her kitchen, that's here, mimicking the airport agents. "Watch out for her," she said, cocking her head and striking a sexy Bond girl pose. But they creeped her out enough that she went to one of the airport security officers, fearful that someone might actually wish to harm her. He looked over at one of the men she'd identified and told her, not at all reassuringly, "Don't worry, he's one of us." Next slide, please. Okay. So Brunhilde pointed me to his artist friend Hadass, who pointed me to Rafat, a Palestinian with Israeli citizenship. At the time that we first connected, they were one of the few early openly genderqueer queers in Tel Aviv. Their performances drew on their neither here nor there status in Israel, and really grappled with the psychic tensions that came with being a Palestinian citizen of Israel, with all of the restrictions to mobility, marriage, army service, housing, and so on that entailed, as well as all of the other everyday violences that come with living with other citizens who are committed to denying the facts of your existence, much less occupation and exclusion. And there really is no outside of this identity in spite of various efforts by Israel to disappear them or to celebrate its treatment of what it calls its Arab citizens, but who are Palestinians. Slide. So for me, and Rafa did some really amazing pieces of performance art, but for me, this is probably one of the most striking. The most haunting character was this character called the Bride of Palestine. The Bride helped them to explore their double consciousness as a Palestinian with Israeli citizenship, which is to say a citizen, as I said, without the same rights or opportunities as Jews. Arouse Palestine is a remainder, an embodied history of exclusion, a rejoinder against the enforced forgetfulness that is institutionalized in Israeli society. As Arouse Palestine, Rafat appeared in torn and bloodied white gowns, her face likewise stained by bloody tears, an arm stretched out in plaintive appeal, or as if in the throes of some intense emotion, just like and unlike other drag queens. Often in the past, when I gave lectures from this project, I would include, go to the next slide. I would include a video of Rafat as the bride in this performance called Hub, or Love, which was performed as part of the Opera Rock Festival in 2008. It's really, really powerful, but it's actually almost too powerful, and I don't want to kind of move into like porno troping in this moment. And I also like can't stop crying sometimes when I see it, so we can't watch it right now. But I'll tell you about it. So the video is grainy and shaky, but the tableau is clear. In the portion I always screen, she stands on a stage with a man to her right who is pointing a gun at her head. The hand holding the gun is bound in rope, its stiff tail pointing toward the bride. Her dark hair makes the white gown glow. Chin lifted, her right arm held tight to her body, fist clenched. When she lifts her arm during the lip sync, you see that the wedding dress is torn, hanging in tatters under her arm. And her wrist, like the man's, is also bound in rope. The two pieces of rope have been severed, but you can feel the pull between the two figures. And he tracks her movements the whole time, the gun always trained on her head. The bride lip syncs to a song called Saufa Nabka, which is a Lebanese nationalist anthem. And it's really campy, but it's also about laying claim to endurance, resilience, and homeland, with lyrics like, "We will stay, my homeland, let's stand together." And the song ends in a wailing crescendo. In the performance, at the wailing crescendo, shots ring out and the bride crumples to the floor. So the Bride of Palestine refers to Jaffa, also called the Bride of the Sea, which is one of the oldest continually inhabited sites in the world and was ethnically cleansed as part of the 1947-1948 Nakba. And Jaffa remains an important symbol of Arab culture and resistance. For many, if not most, it's a novel tourist attraction with great flea markets on the weekend and authentic Arab food. And on visits with Brunhilde's mom and family, we'd eat at the hummus shop Ali Caravan, which was kind of touted as like the place where Israelis and Palestinians come together. Or we would eat ice cream and take it to a 1,000-year-old vantage point that overlooks the port, conjuring images of the now almost empty port, but imagining it bustling with activity. The old city is a doll's house version of its past, with stores selling overpriced kitsch, art, and textiles. Rafat had like a really curious, like what I found to be a really interesting take about the bride. And they said that the bride had helped them to gather together their frayed edges. And that after years of kind of personal like self-work, they said, I got to a place where I understand who I am. That after years of inhabiting this character or being inhabited by her, the bride had gotten them to a place. She was a mirror, a weapon, and a guide. By the time I'd interviewed them, Rafat had already retired this character. They told me that they were sure that she would return, but they were less interested in making art that was about the political or social situation. They wanted to make art that wasn't responding to that, but was coming from inside of me, something without limits. And when they talked about the art that they wanted to make, and I should say that at a certain moment, I was no longer able to get in touch with Rafat. And it wasn't just me, but everyone who knew them, like suddenly Rafat just like disappeared. But when they told me this about wanting to make this art from inside without limits, like the last conversation we had, what they described were memories of them and their mother and aunts, where they would all gather together on the balcony of their Jaffa apartment to talk and love, to look down to the street life below, and to laugh. Thank you. So what I want to do is we're going to shift gears a little bit. So this was really kind of a part of the talk to focus on, I think, to speak to the moment that we're in. But I also want to speak to where we're at, which is New York, and to speak to you know, part of what I discovered through this project, especially working with people who had been students at Purchase. And the book is bookended, I should say, with stories about students. And although Max was never my student, Max was part of this drag culture at Purchase that inspired me to, like, not just the RuPaul's Drag Race I was binging with my ex, but that inspired me to actually write this book. And when I ran into trouble, you know, because the relationship had ended and because I didn't know if I would be able to go back and like deal with the mourning, and also the topic was really hard. It was my students who, in fact, I think even Christoph was one of those students at the time, who said something like, you know, you guys are all characters in this book. You need to think about them in that way. And it gave me a kind of route back into the project. So the book is bookended with stories about pedagogy. And then there are two chapters, although, yeah, there are two chapters that are basically just me and talking with students. And one of them is a chapter with Max and another with a student named Nico, who wasn't able to be here today. So Max, you want to come on up?
Feel free to take that off if you want.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I know it's like we're doing like the shift, but so when I first, okay, so first of all, like everyone at Purchase was super, super open and welcoming when I approached them to be like, oh, you guys know about drag, you guys know more about drag than me. And you were like, yes. And just like even with today, I was like, oh, hey, do you want to come and be part of this thing? And you're like, yes.
Yes.
There was no like nothing complicated. And so when I first interviewed you in 2018, you were just you were just like maybe 2 or 3 years into kind of like the Brooklyn drag king scene. And then since then you won Best Drag King. You were part of Nighthawks. We saw you at like, you know, at Yonkers Pride.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, doing great performances. And now you have this YouTube channel, which I also show my students in the class I still teach about drag. When it's like how to lip sync, we watch your video on like how to lip sync appropriately. So I'm just curious, like, if you want to talk about like 2018 to now, and then I think, you know, in keeping with thinking about drag and politics, like, you know, Max is such a exuberant, joyful. I think that's like part of what Max brings, right? Like what you bring to it's like just this joyful power. And maybe you want to talk about that in this moment where some people don't like drag that much.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And thank you so much for sharing this. I think your book is really, it's funny, it came out so many years ago. And we're talking about it so many years ago, and now here we are, and it feels more relevant and helpful than ever. I know I was really glad to have it to turn to this past week, especially. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
What did you ask me?
I think talk to us about drag since 2018 for you.
Oh,
and maybe also just like, you know, like as Max, like how do you, like you could be doing like quote unquote political drag, right? And I think in a way that you are, but I'm interested in Max and Joy.
Sure. Okay, I can definitely talk about that. Well, when we talked, that was 2018. That seems like truly a lifetime ago. I like, it's funny, but it's also not, like, the ways that my life has changed since then, I can't even count on one hand. So many things have changed. I've learned so much since then. I hit 10 years of drag this year, which is which is so insane. Of course, my first time was at Purchase 2014. Shout out Sherry Poppins, we love her. Bless you. But it's just been so incredible to. I keep realizing there's so much more to learn about drag, and even our interview, I ended by saying, oh, I hope there's like more for me to do. I hope there's more for me to learn. And that's just so nuts because yes, there is. And even this year, 2024, I'm like, there's so much more for me to learn. There's so many, I'm talking about skill, like stage skill. I learned how to tassel twirl this year, which is crazy. And I mean, so many different skills, but also there are so many different ways to be a drag artist. And there is a never-ending pool of inspiration to pull from. And tapping into that has been so important, especially because it's so easy to get jaded in the drag scene. It's so easy to be like, I'm tired of you people. I'm tired of gigging in this bathroom. What am I doing here? This isn't a dressing room. It's so important to tap into that, to know that there's always inspiration to be struck, and keeping in mind that change is constantly happening doesn't have to be a scary thing. Yeah.
I mean, when we spoke in 2018, you also, I think we're starting to take a break. You were in a break because like I think maybe something in the drag scene, there had been some intense stuff going on, and you were like, you needed a little moment. So what brought you back to drag?
I mean, it was just, I needed time. I needed to
Okay. You needed space. Yeah, okay. Yeah, no, that's fine. So we're also in this moment, like this very intense moment for everyone, I'm guessing here, of what has happened over the last week. If I want to take you like even darker places.
Yes.
You know, and I think about, you know, the people that I talk about in the book, you know, I chose artists and activists because I wanted people who okay, let me back up. When I first started writing this book, it was called The Political Aesthetics of Drag, or Drag as a Non-Fascist Practice of Life. It was this very like academically ambitious thing, and I was going to deal with this philosopher, Jacques Rancière, and in the end, I had all these people telling me in like 2012, it's like, what is fascism? What are you talking about? Fascism and drag and like anti-fascism, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, look, something's coming. Like trust me, you know, Viktor Orban had already been on the rise in Hungary. Like these right-wing politics were happening all over the world. And it wasn't that I just saw drag as a solution. Like drag has problems, right? As an industry, as a, you know, like you talked about the difficulty of gigging, or like what led you to like take a step away. But I was like, there is something in drag as like, I thought of it as like this non-fascist practice of life. So maybe just think about like Max in this moment, like how do you see your drag contributing?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, I mean, there's a lot of people that believe that drag is inherently political, which I agree with, but my drag isn't, to call myself an activist, I think would be self-aggrandizing. The thing that I keep returning to over these past few days is fear, obviously. But the thing that has kept me from completely spiraling out and just panicking is the idea that I think I'm no expert. I lack a lot of knowledge about politics and about our government. But one thing I do know about is how to be a neighbor and how to be a coworker and how to be a community member. And I think from how I see it, people have become increasingly isolated from one another. The pandemic obviously did that in a really dramatic way, but even like I think about streaming, I think about social media, I feel that people have become increasingly isolated from one another. And something that even the most unknowledgeable person can do is be a neighbor and a coworker and a community member. Because it's those little moments of connection, of care that we show one another. I think it keeps us connected. It reminds us all of our humanity. And maybe that'll stop someone who maybe is kind of in the clutches of like right-wing thinking. Like maybe just by the way that we touch the world can inspire those that we touch to be like, wait, no, actually, I don't hate people. I actually care about people. I know this person is a drag performer and I know that they're a good person and they're not a pedophile. Like, if that makes sense, yeah.
And look, drag is always a dialogue, right? Like drag, there is no drag without an audience, right? And so, yeah, like dancing, singing, humor, right? Like even the provocations, like the teasing that I think is so integral to drag. Like it doesn't have to be, you know, some complicated like political statement to be like, I think as you said, to make this like really important impact. When I saw you at Yonkers, you know, and I think this again characterizes your thing, you are like so in it. And I know you have like a musical theater.
Oh yeah,
back
a
from,
little,
like, the day.
yeah.
So I can see you like living your best life, but it's also like not every drag performer, like it seems to me sometimes wants to actually connect with their audience. Like they're performing, they're up there performing, but you are like looking at people, you are like
I remember it staring
doing,
me
like,
down.
you're doing like all the things to like to do that. I think what you just said about making contact makes community, and it seems like you're really committed to that.
Yeah, I mean, drag is so interesting because so much of it is about feeling your own fantasy, which I love. But when you take that on stage, when you're a performer, it is about going beyond yourself and connecting with that audience. And actually, kind of to like connect all that we're talking about, like I think of Switch and Play, which is a historic drag collective. That is a space where we celebrate queerness. And I think that's so special because we don't celebrate queerness that often. And instead we're, you know, fighting for our right to be here, and we're in our in our offices like, oh yeah, my girlfriend and I did this thing, and like we're just struggling to exist and struggling to work past fear, versus when you're at a drag show, let's just celebrate that. Like, show me your hairy legs, king. You know what I mean? Like, and I think that's just being able, we don't have to explain ourselves at a drag show. We can just be. And I think that's something that's really special and something that I'm really looking forward to tap into as things get possibly increasingly scary.
Yeah, I mean, it's like my stomach, my butthole are just like so tightly.
Yeah.
It's like, I mean, and it's like a weird metaphor. I'm not sure it works, but I just keep thinking I'm being like forced to go to like the haunted amusement park, and I have to get on all the rides for like the next 4 years, and like no one will let me off. And I'm just like, I need to like just work my core, you know, like what, you know, one of the things I think about, you know, I didn't talk about it so much in my talk, but
and thinking about something like Switch and Play. And I came up sort of like my first exposure to like drag was actually through Drag Kings in Austin. So I was like I was like letting them like whip me on stage and put out cigarettes on me and, you know, doing like getting them to recruit me to do like lap dances and stuff. Like I was the Drag Kings bitch, right? So
We all need.
so I came up like through like this kind of dyke trans drag culture.
Mhm.
And it was way later, you know, it was only in like 2012 when I really like encountered the, you know, RuPaul stuff that I was like, oh, this is different. But RuPaul has had this like, huge impact on drag globally. And it's sort of in the background of my book, but there is this like homogenizing, sorry, like now the drag race stars are fans are gonna like come for me online or something. But like there's a homogenizing, I think, influence of RuPaul, like for all the good that it has done for exposing drag to broader audiences, I do think that there's also been a kind of like flattening, even in the sense that like everything has to be so professionalized now. And although you see it maybe on some of the other franchises, like if you look to RuPaul's Drag Race, like the main seasons, they don't want the queer with hairy legs.
Yeah.
Right? It's like you have to have a certain shape, you have to have a certain aesthetic. There's a level of professionalism, and I think you bring you have a very professional thing going on, but there's also like, where is the room still for like wildness or those like rough queer edges? And I'm curious like where you experience that or maybe where you see that in drag now.
I mean, first I'll say I'm not afraid of the Drag Race stands. I one time tweeted RuPaul, I said with every new version of Drag Race comes out, it becomes increasingly clear that RuPaul doesn't give a fuck about drag kings. And I think I got death threats for that, but I stand by it. But I mean, I think that the rough around the edges drag, the non-femme drag, the drag king drag, the drag thing drag, that is really where the spirit of drag is. I always say this, I mean, and it sounds weird coming from me because my drag is relatively tame. Like the character that I portray comes across as like pretty cis and everything. But the best kind of drag is the drag that doesn't play by the rules. Like that's the true essence of the thing. And we do lose that when all we see on Drag Race are drag queens. It's funny though, did you notice that more and more often drag queens are doing king drag or boy drag on the show? I find that interesting. It's almost as if playing a male
it's just a
character
matter
can be
of time.
fun.
It's, you know, like they set it up just the same around, you know, the inclusion of trans people, where it's like they set this norm and then the norm starts to get kind of eroded at the edges. And when they see there's enough kind of momentum, then they're like, oh yeah, we've always supported this, you know? So I think it is a matter of time before they need also drag kings and what drag kings bring. Because it's not as if drag queens have ever existed without drag kings.
Yeah.
Like, period.
A lot of people don't know that.
They always, like, that always happened together. So it is a very interesting exclusion, but I think one whose time will probably, I predict in the next couple of years will be done.
We'll see.
Maybe not on the main show, but definitely on one of the franchises.
Yeah, and I would love to see that.
Yeah.
Would love, yeah.
Maybe we should do some Q&A.
Sounds good to me.
So, and you can add more whenever you need, but there are people who maybe have questions, comments, thoughts. Because I can keep talking to you also.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm really curious about the idea of art as activism, and I'm curious where you think you can like draw the line between something that sort of pushes people away from the actual movement and something that sort of draws them in. Because I think it's, yeah, the example you gave earlier, I forgot the name, but the sort of mocking someone for their identity as a German person and the Nazi comparison. And I mean, it's like something that really, Yeah, so that's it.
Yeah, I mean, that's why it was part of this, like the seed of this project. It was so jarring to see an Israeli Jew be like, oh, welcome to Israel, we're doing the same thing. You know, it just was like, and Diva D also was, I think, already doing a lot of activism in her daily life as well. So I made a conscious decision to really pick, like, in general, like especially with the Israel-Palestine stuff, to pick people who were doing, it's like self-consciously doing activism. But I think, as Max was saying, the art of drag, like, is not restricted to like these sort of narrow ideas about political activism either, right? Because like building community is political action, right? It might not be structured in a kind of ideological framework, a certain kind of ideological framework. But to your point about pushing people away, I think historically, as Max was also saying, like parts of drag do exactly that, right? And it's in that experience of like discomfort or aversion that one's own politics become like clear. You know, like with Liad, you know, she's an Ashkenazi, she's like a white Jew from Israel, but she's doing this like Arab burlesque. And I'm like, is this wrong? You know, and at one point I remember having like ice cream with her in Berlin, and she was like, do you think I'm gonna get in trouble? And she's been doing this for years, right? Like in Israel and in Berlin. And she's like, and I couldn't tell if she was like taking the shit or not. You know, if she was actually kind of almost like testing me to see how far she could push me with this, right? Because on the surface, if some white person was like, I'm gonna do like Arab drag, I'd be like, I think it's a really bad idea. But then to have someone who has been like immersed in, who'd been going to the West Bank for a really, really long time, who'd been doing like on the ground organizing, who'd been organizing against the apartheid wall, who'd been doing all this stuff, and who's like, I'm an artist. This is what I'm like pulling this Israeli flag for my pussy. Like, I'm like, I don't know, I can't tell you what to do. So I think it's like, this is the thing around, I think also about RuPaul, is that in general, the drag that RuPaul and the franchise has kind of promoted is palatable, right? It is kind of drag that has been largely defanged, not totally, especially in like some of the other shows, you see still this like, these edges come through, but very seldom are those the people who end up in the final four. Right?
Yeah, that's a good point. Drag Race definitely lifts up the most palatable. And that's why we don't see like gender fucky drag on Drag Race. Because that is almost too much, you know?
Yeah. And I think there was actually, I just assigned something to my students recently that was about Drag Race, and RuPaul was actually explicit in this, where, because she had been doing gigs still, and she, you know, her whole thing was from the beginning was like gender fuck. And at a certain moment, she's like, you know what, I am gonna take the sex out of drag. And that's when she moved into the Glamazon moment. And, you know, that first big single supermodel of the world, blah, blah, blah. I mean, she's like walking down the street with kids, right? Like, am I misremembering this? Like, it's this total, like, she's a, not, I don't want to say it, she's not a clown, because it is gorgeous. It is dramatic. It is beautiful. And it is great to see a fucking 6 foot whatever drag queen walking down the street with kids. Like, amazing, more. But it was also like defanged. I will tell you a funny story though. So one of the other people I interviewed for the book was Vaginal Davis. And so she came over to my apartment in Berlin. And when I say interviewed, it was not an interview. She totally held court. She just talked at me for like 3.5 hours. I asked like 2 questions. She kind of would like read me sometimes for the questions. And I had the recorder on and I just recorded. But one of the things that she said was that RuPaul stole the blonde hair from her. Because she had been doing that same, Vaginal Davis had been doing that same thing. Yeah.
And what did you say to that?
You can't disagree with Miss Davis.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't intervene. Yeah. So
Yeah,
I just, I
it's fun-
believe it.
It's funny, I have a friend who was part of the scene when RuPaul was part of it and not RuPaul yet. But when everyone found out that RuPaul was getting her own show, apparently the common consensus was her, which is nuts. And I have to get more details on that, but
Yeah,
I love to gossip.
yeah.
Should be your next YouTube video.
Yeah, bring me onto your channel.
It's
I'll
truth
make it
about
do-
RuPaul.
The truth. George, yeah. Hi.
And I don't know if you guys have heard of the show Dragula, but I'm curious how you feel about that show and how it kind of figures into this conversation, especially with there being a drag king on that show that did really well.
Mm.
And like this idea of deep banging drag and like how a show like that factors into that.
You wanna go first?
Yeah, that's a great question. Dragula is so interesting. I am a fan of the show. I haven't watched the most recent season, but it is really special to me, and I do really appreciate how they have drag queens, drag kings, and drag things, drag performers that don't identify in either of those categories compete for one crown. I think that's really special. Yeah, and I do think that Dragula sets a great example for that. And people often are like, why can't Drag Race do that? Why can't RuPaul do that? I don't think RuPaul's competition makes room for that difference. Because people do ask me, they're like, what do you think RuPaul should do? Do you think RuPaul should have drag kings? Do you want to be on it? I'm like, no, I don't, but thank you. I don't think the way that Drag Race is currently set up would allow for a drag king to excel. They would have to make so many changes to the way that they run their competition. I personally, if you're asking, I would think that at least one of the million spinoffs that RuPaul has should be a drag king one. That's how I would like to see it, because that's an environment in which a drag king can excel. And that often, unfortunately, is the case a lot of the time. A drag king is thrown into the ring somewhere, but he's not allowed to excel. I've competed in competitions before where they're like, the queen that wins will get this crown. And my friends are like, wait, aren't you eligible for the crown? I'm like, yeah. They just said queen though, so nobody knows. Like, so I do really appreciate that combining. Even though I have my reservations.
What would be some challenges that you would propose? You know, you're saying that if RuPaul could be more inclusive, they would have to rework it. So I'm just curious if you, off the top of your head, if you have any ideas of what those kind of.
That's a good question. I mean, a lot of the challenges could be the same. It's just the measure of success would have to be altered. I'm gonna have to think about that though.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I think one of the fundamental challenges is that femininity is already about a kind of artifice and heightened performance. And so when in drag queening, it's about like turning up the volume. And then the trick with drag kinging, a lot of times, there's a different thing happening, like, because masculinity is supposed to be unperformed, is supposed to be subtle, is supposed to like not be excessive, right? And I think that's one of the things interesting about Max is you're actually mixing the two, right?
Yeah.
But so kinging, a lot of times it's about this like subtle play. So when I used to go see some of the like some things that would stand out for me when I think about drag king performances that I used to see would be like someone who would pass as like a guy on the street singing like Isaac Hayes in this completely seductive way. And that's the performance, right? It's not about drawing attention to the heightened nature of the performance. It's about this like really subtle, but other times it was about a heightened nature. So I remember this one, I can't remember what they performed it to, but it was the drag king, one of the drag king troops in Austin. And they often would do things where they were portraying gay men,
Yeah.
right? So it was like, that was like a big part of the culture. It was like, part of them doing, like kinging was doing certain kind of feminized forms of masculinity. So I remember this like one really, I can't remember the details, but it was like all about like Boy Scouts cruising, you know? So it was like using their kind of, this kind of like dykey, trans, and ambiguous, like this kind of in-between masculinity, and keeping that knob there in this ambiguity, and then playing with this like boyish, queer, like thing. And they got away with like, the drag kings would get away with crazy shit, like on stage. Like, yeah, I remember lots of fun performances. To Dragula, I've never seen tons of Dragula. I've seen like a lot of it. I think in the end, it's still a reality TV show. So I remember we had a conversation last week in drag class, and you know, people were like, "Well, what would you say?" Kind of was a similar. It was like, "What would you say?" Like you're saying, "Don't have reality TV," and I was like, "I actually think you could have a great TV show that didn't rely on people being like worked to the bone, you know, making like a few $100s per episode." Being like manipulated by producers into storylines that they didn't consent to. Like you could have a show that wasn't those things that people would still watch because it's art. Yeah, Renee.
So one of the things I saw over here on the train was this kind of PSA from Trump about like
my butthole and my stomach.
Oh, like young girl, like trans people go off in public life, like y'all are out of here, or investigate all these hospitals. It's not happening through insurance anymore. We're cutting any funding for anything that has to do with trans people, and we're only supporting things that support this very strict binary definition. By the way, he said like gender is male or female, and I was like, Google, those are biological sexes. But anyways, it really like I'm sitting in the train like fried because that's all I can think about is like I'm non-binary, and like there's like, you know, minimal visibility for non-binary people, and you know that's all T, and so I can't like even function to like put a thought together to think about that. But in terms of drag, I also went to Denison, shout out to Denison. One of the fellow alums from Denison is Nina West, the shoulders of drag. And what she does is just very like Disney as happy, palatable drag, but it's palatable in like a different way. It's like a way for drag to persist in this neoliberal era where it's like we're going to compare drag with kids, and like, you know, growing up here in Detroit, I was always of the opinion, I was very like anti-nuclear family, like fuck kids, fuck the family, like no, boo all that, right? Tomato. And I'm just like thinking about like what happened to that? Like what happened to this a type of drag that didn't cater to that? It feels like it's disappeared. Or I know there's drag in bars, but like there's just something that happened where it's like the national conversation became about drag in bookstores and kids, and I was like, huh? Not that it shouldn't happen or that
No, I mean,
people's outrage is inappropriate, because it is, right? It's just like drag queens and books.
I mean, in a weird way, we have RuPaul to thank for this, right? Like, not to blame RuPaul for making drag so popular, but when I was doing research in Berlin, it was already this thing where the like everywhere had their kind of like quote unquote indigenous drag scenes, right? Like everyone had like histories of male and female impersonation, of gender play, of gender fuck. Everyone had their own thing going on. And then part of what's happened is there's now this like kind of, again, kind of globally homogenized thing. And on the one hand, it gained a lot of it gained visibility for people. More people could get gigs, you know, which went as far as people getting gigs, reading books to kids. I think that's fine, you know, like, and I think that there's room for all kinds of drag. I think what part we're both sort of agree on is that there is now like this kind of like flattening of it. But it's, you know, this is the the double-sidedness of visibility, right? The kind of trap of visibility is that once you become real visible, then the target becomes much bigger,
Mhm.
right? And so with all of the anti-drag and anti-trans stuff, trans people make up 0.5% of the population. But and Republicans spent like tens of millions of dollars advertising, $65 million on anti-trans stuff to get people to be like, an 18-year-old man is going to be playing in your 9-year-old girl's basketball team. It's like, it's inside out, upside down, cat boys peeing in the corner in the litter box, right? And there's a couple of things that come to mind of this. Like, one of the key elements of fascism is signaling to like traditional values, and gender is fundamental to that. Traditional values means women are subservient to men, that you've seen this kind of going around right now, your body, my choice, which just sends shivers up my spine, right? This idea that women's bodies, reproductive bodies, are for men to control. And what's happened is like gender roles have changed. There are more queer people visible, more trans people visible, more NB people visible, and that makes people like really upset. So the visibility has, kind of swung back at us. It isn't to say that we should now go back and like be DL, or to blame anyone for it. Like, it's funny, I think RuPaul is worth about $65 million now, thanks to the fracking and everything. It's not to blame RuPaul either, but it is this weird double-edged sword, right? Like, as we became more visible, we become like bigger targets. But every time Trump says something, we should listen to him and we should believe what he says. But he also is so disorganized and so chaotic, he can't get shit done. So
Yeah.
don't lose hope. I know your sister has something, but yeah, go ahead, Max.
Oh, no, very well said.
Yeah.
I was just, yesing along. What's your question?
I'm curious for you, Max, like I know so many of your influences to your character are men who experiment with their gender. And I know that when you first started, and a lot of the other kings who we saw like in that scene were performing this masculinity that was almost violent, like misogynistic, definitely. So I'm curious to you, like what performing masculinity means to you, especially in this time.
That's a good question.
It was, and I didn't even tell her to say that. No, that's a great question. I mean, when I first started drag and became a drag king, so much of the drag king performances that I saw were story based. And I'm a drag king that loves to tell a story. I'm like, we're gonna do a mix. I'm gonna get the girl at the end, like happy ending, like love will prevail. But often that kind of storytelling fell into the trap of like womanizing characters. And it was so fun to get up on stage at Fall Ball and like have these sexy stories. Like it was a lot of fun to express sexuality that way, in a way that I hadn't been able to before. But I did fall into this trap of playing a masculine character whose masculinity was dependent on his ability to get women. And when we talked in 2018, I reviewed it, thought about it differently. Then when the book came out, I reviewed it, I thought about it differently. And now here we are, and I'm thinking about all those times differently. I think it's so important as a lesbian, as a dyke, to be able to express desire. I feel so often lesbians are kind of put into this box where we can touch each other's hands, we can caress each other's cheeks, but that's pretty much it. And that just does us such a disservice. For so many years of my life, I felt that my desire for I'm remembering my mom's here. Sorry, sorry, Mom, I'm gonna talk about you, like, I'm not gonna talk about you, I'm gonna talk about you're not here. Love you. I felt like a pervert for the desire that I felt for women. I felt like that made me an aggressor. It made me like
A bad man.
a bad man. And being able to show that desire for women on stage was really important and really helpful to me. But I did trip up on this thing. So I've kind of found a place where the masculinity that I present on stage, there was a little bit of
You flirt with it. You flirt with everyone.
there's a little bit of, I wouldn't say womanizing because it comes from a very respectful place. But it's a lot about not just power, but standing on one's principles. That's something that, as in my day-to-day life, is important to me. So my masculinity is about power in the way that I'm going to be here. I'm going to stand by my principles. I'm also going to be hot and sexy too. But that's where a lot of it comes from. It's from taking care of the people around me, showing up for the people around me, showing up for myself. A lot of that masculinity, of course, comes from my father as well. Like, my dad is like the best, and there's nothing he wouldn't do for his family and the people around him. And that is a masculinity that I really draw on.
Yeah, I think I've been thinking about this lately as like soft daddy energy or
Mhm.
something.
Yeah.
You know, where it's like so much of like the masculinity that I want to embody is actually drawn from like powerful feminine energy, you know? And it's like and then like the feminine energy I have is like very daddy energy. It's like very like
See,
I
that
really
makes
care and
perfect
nurture
sense
for
to
you,
me.
but yeah.
Yeah.
I see the K, yeah.
So my question is, I loved what the third artist in your slideshow said, the bride, about how, tell me if I'm interpreting this wrong, but the idea of maybe taking a step back and like wanting to have that intimacy time with her family, with their family. I thought that was very beautiful. It ties to some of the like break taking we were talking about earlier. So since we have you, can we get some BTS with the book of how the folks that you interviewed and got to know feel about the book, or if they've sort of shifted in their artistry since it's come out, and really since like October 7th and the plethora of other horrible things that have happened since you wrote it a couple years ago.
Yeah, sure. So I was actually just rereading the like afterward on the drive down. And, you know, I couldn't really touch the book for like a year. And even after, when it came out in like the middle of the pandemic, like the hard copy came out in like summer of 21, I didn't do any promotion, any press. I did one reading in like Provincetown that someone asked me because he was doing something. I don't think I even sold those 3 copies of that book that I left there. But in the last year or so, since October 7th, I'm like, all right, there's a reason I fucking wrote this book, and it's still just as relevant now. And so I need to be like, not just promoting it, but I need to be talking about what's in the book. And but yeah, as I was reading the after as it came down, so there are people who aren't doing drag anymore. Some of them who are doing it very differently. Like I said, Rafat just sort of disappeared. If you're watching, like, say hi. You know, the purchase drag culture also changed quite a bit, I think, where it was super, super active when you were there, like 2015, I would say through like 2018, 2019. And it wasn't just the pandemic, it was like there was a different crop. Maybe Gawain and Theo can say something differently, but I just don't think there was like, there was an era where there was like a drag performance on campus, a drag show on campus in housing every week of this semester. I don't think that happened when you guys were there. So there was this like super active drag scene that doesn't exist on campus anymore. Even as drag, people are still interested in drag. And that again predates the pandemic, but the pandemic intensified it. You know, the other big thing was like the college, which is known for its like progressive and feminist and queer values, like really had a really hard fail this year. So, you know, our leadership really, I think, mishandled how they responded to the October 7th attacks and the aftermath. And and I would simply say took a very kind of they took a pro-Israel stance in ways that I think alienated a lot of people. They refused to meet with people who had different views. And this resulted on May 2nd in the arrest of about 70 students and 6 faculty, myself included. The students were there peacefully protesting, in fact, silently protesting, while the police helicopter went above the campus. For those of you who don't know, Purchase is this like suburban, like ex-urban campus in the middle of Westchester on like 400 acres.
Yeah.
It's not like, you know, it's not Columbia, it's not NYU. A big police drone, and you know, the students became totally silent at like 10 p.m. at the beginning of quiet hours, and then were violently arrested by police. You know, I have to say for our colleagues, you know, we did stand up, we did vote no, you know, we basically said the next day this was totally unacceptable. It never happened in the history of the college, anything like it. We voted no confidence in the president. She is leaving in the end of the spring. She's retiring. But I think for a lot of people, the idea that the college is this liberal oasis or progressive oasis was kind of like shattered. Of course, that was already the truth for people like Black people in particular at the college. And you know, I think some trans and NB people as well didn't feel it was as queer as people thought it was. But yeah, that's sort of where it's at now. Yeah. Yeah, going.
Not but it's a question for both of you, I guess. In this sort of political moment, do you foresee the potential of drag returning to its roots as a tool for community building and resistance to this kind of like, I guess, oppression that has ebbed and flowed? Or do you foresee it continuing to, as it moves more into the mainstream, become more kind of divisive? And do you see it becoming a tool to form community resistance or to continue to malign each other?
I mean, drag still is this rebellious thing. It's just that rebellious drag you have to go out and see in person. We're not going to see the rebellious drag on our Instagram feeds, on television. It's something that you still need to go out and see. I am hoping that that rebellious spirit does get amplified, you know, as things continue. But I'm sure there will still be drag that is very palatable and not hardcore or punk in any way. We'll still see that because that's kind of drag that makes money. But that rebellious drag is still very much alive.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I think that, you know, drag isn't going anywhere. And I think that the kind of, you know, gender outlaws and weirdos who have been at the forefront of drag are going to keep doing that. You know, keep in mind, like more than 100 years ago, there were, you know, laws put into place that would ban people from wearing, you know, clothing of the opposite sex. You know, we see this kind of stuff happening again. Like these things do like seesaw, and you know, I don't really do hope per se. Like that's not really my jam. It's like the word doesn't even come like easily to me. But I will say, like, don't despair, because not just is there like work to be done, which I also am not into work, but but that life is more than mere survival. And I think we learned that during the pandemic. I think drag is really, really good at giving us all kinds of reminders about that and all kinds of tools to, like in my original construction, to like live a non-fascist practice of life, which is basically living a life that is really skeptical of the desire to be led. So yes, I think drag is going to do this fine. And I think with that, maybe we should wrap it up. Thank you so much, everyone. For coming. Thank you so much. Everyone online. Support the Bureau.